So how are you doing, Sean?
Well, I actually just came from Madison, Wisconsin, where 40 environmental scientists and faith leaders were gathered. And it was, in a certain way, not a heartening gathering. Yeah. And clearly, one of the most renowned scientists in the area of the environment right now is a woman called Diana Lieberman from the University of Arizona. And she was laying out some of the statistics. Bill McKibben talks about tipping point. We've gone over. And it will, take several generations if we all work together to dial back the situation that we've created for all beings on this earth. So I think we're at a very critical point for people who have a contemplative life. I think having a contemplative life is virtuous, but I think it's not enough.
Yeah. And how can, that's what I ask myself often. How can we affect change in a compassionate and equanimous manner? How can we step out the door every morning and be ready to help to actuate change without getting involved in our own suffering and our own despair about the situation, but actually moving into service? That's work that you've been doing all your life with the dying and different groups that you've been working with.
Actually, that's, I think, a really good point. One of the things that we talked about in the Madison meeting was the pervasiveness of futility.
Exactly.
And what can we as faith leaders do in relation to futility that is not only touching young people, but really the whole lifespan,
right?
People and in many different cultures. And I think that my experience of working with dying people has been a great teaching in the sense that you can be guaranteed it's 100% attrition rate. That, every person that I've worked with who was actively dying met death, as we all will. And one of the things that I learned is you give the best you can, and you cannot be attached to outcome.
Right, right. And then you get up the next day and you do your best again and again. I find that working in the criminal justice system completely. We work with people and we're trying to get them out of jail, and then parole is denied. Parole is denied. 30 years go by, and every year you still bring the case forward. You bring the case forward that people in their 70s do not need to be in prison anymore. Do not need to be in prison. And they're consistently still being denied parole. And yet, the next morning, we get up and we make another petition, and we make another phone call, and then someone gets out. Judith Clark was just released.
Yeah, I saw
after
that.
43
and
years.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Roshi, because you really contributed to her liberation.
Right.
A question that I have that you just pointed toward is there an alternative to the so-called criminal justice system?
I've just been to Alabama, to Montgomery, and the Legacy Museum there that was developed by Brian Stevenson develops the argument compellingly that mass incarceration is simply the next step after slavery. And you can see it in all of the documents. The museum itself is in a warehouse where slaves were kept before they were sold. And all of the material and the data that you get it was when they could, after 1807, the Atlantic Slave Trade Act was passed. They couldn't have any more slaves, and so they just incarcerated people and then sold them to the different businessmen and farmers. And that's what's going on today. If you look at the business of prisons, it's slavery.
And it's also, those prisons are in the, quotes, poorest parts of the country, the parts that are most economically distressed.
Exactly. Exactly.
And, you know, and I was a volunteer at the Penitentiary of New Mexico in maximum security and death row for 6 years. And I have to say, there wasn't one rich white man there. And you also realize that the correctional institution that I was working in, volunteering in, was a kind of breeder reactor of violence.
Yeah, right.
There's those people, it was all men I worked with, but really anyone who would be exposed to that system would be so deeply traumatized again that should they ever be released, and of course people are released from PNM who are in level 1, 2, and 3, you know, have basically been conditioned toward more violence, toward more hatred.
Exactly, exactly. And there is change happening. And that's one of the reasons to bring it up, is that there is change happening in the criminal justice system now. And it's a result of people like us in this room writing letters, actually going and seeing your representatives and letting them know that this is an issue that you care about, and beginning to make a difference. And it's happening. It's happening for good reasons, and it's happening for reasons that are like still tied to greed. They have to do, oh, the prisons are so expensive, maybe we should let some people out.
But, you know, I will say, working in the, you know, what's called now level 6, when I was working inside, there weren't these kind of designations. But, you know, I did encounter people whom I feel
need therapy.
Well, at least need therapy. And I actually, you know, didn't feel comfortable with them at all. Right. They definitely were wounded to the core. You know, it's one of those things where you're reminded of the story of Angulimala, a serial killer who went through this phenomenal conversion upon encountering the Buddha. And so, you know, sometimes I would say, if I, you know, was working with somebody who was, you know, particularly strange and wounded, you know, I would sort of say, well, maybe not this lifetime. I'd say that to myself, maybe next lifetime. Right. But Angulimala was an inspiration for many of us who worked inside.
Exactly.
You know, it's just like it can happen like that.
Most of the people inside are not what you're talking about, but there are some severely people who are inclined to violence. And you look at the Swedish prison system, where, yes, they have some people who are incarcerated and you look at the spaces that they're in, they're very nice rooms. They have a TV. They're not being punished and their fingernails aren't being pulled out. They are held in an enclosed space where they won't harm others. And yet they're fed, they're able to cook their own food. They're able to have some kind of a life, even though it's diminished in terms of freedom, so that they can't harm others. But it's not the punishing system that we have in this country.
So, Enki, I think one of the things that's interesting that you and I, our Zen peacemaker brothers and sisters, you know, we're socially engaged Buddhists. And I'm really interested in the presence and growing socially engaged Buddhism as a movement of great diversity, not only in this country and other places where it's strong, like in Sri Lanka with Ari and in Thailand with Sulak and so on, but to really see if it can be a global movement of inclusivity around alternatives to violence.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that was, we did have an event last night honoring Bernie Glassman, and that was his dream of Zen peacemakers, of course. We dropped the Zen and we just called it Peacemakers International, which opens it up to people of any faith and all kinds of Buddhism. And the point that Joan's making is we based it on the idea that we can bear witness to the suffering of others. And once we bear witness, once we're connected to what's happening to others, then we can find skillful means to make change. But we can't come in from the top down and say, oh, this has to be changed or that has to be changed. One of the things that Bernie started were street retreats, where you actually go and live on the street for a week and see what it's like, see what the problems are. And, you know, for me, the worst problem was bathrooms. It's like, and but you see what it is, and then you begin to see what kinds of things can happen in my city or in my country that would make a difference. What really would make a difference? So that bearing witness is critically important. And Joan was kind of referring to her work with the dying, and her work in a jail, in a prison. When you go and, you know, when I go into Sing Sing, it takes an hour and 15 minutes before I can actually get to the space where we do the meditation. We have to go through all of these gates and all of these tortured guards who are really suffering also because of the kind of work that they have to do. And so you realize I'm going into a place where everyone is suffering.
You know, thank you. When I started working with Bernie, it was a little after the DC event. And Bernie was talking about the three, and Jishu, they were talking about the three tenets. And I thought, oh, this is the coolest process.
Right.
It's a practice. I mean, if you can imagine all the biases that I, as a sort of middle-class, white Buddhist, middle-aged, I was middle-aged then, person, you know, all the biases. I was afraid the first time I went into the prison, into PNM. I was really afraid. It was big guys. And one of the things that came up for me is that the training for volunteers was, you know, kind of interesting. They said, well, if you're taken hostage, we're not responsible. And I'm like, oh, well, thanks a lot. Gee, that really, you know, inspires and gives me a lot of incentive to ever come back. But of course I did. I really got into the work because it was kind of like sprouts breaking the sort of cement apart, you know, on a late spring day. You realize there is life here somehow. Right. But when Bernie shared, and Jishu shared the three tenets with me, I was like, wow. The first tenet, which Gyoku talked about last night, not knowing, was so radical. You know, how do you cultivate a quality of mind that's not caught in biases, or that is aware at least of, you know, at the preconscious level, moving down through, you know, practice of the biases that are beginning to, you know, distort how you perceive things. It
is the most important of the three, I think.
Totally.
Because when we think we know, you know, with all our best intentions, we already go in with this cognitive bias, and so we only see what we've decided to see. And this idea that Bernie just put that at the foundation of the peacemakers, which is not knowing, really being fresh and seeing what's arising in the moment, what's happening, as opposed to what I think is happening, what I think the causes and conditions are. Instead, that free moment. You're absolutely right.
And then, you know, the same with the work with dying people. It was such a powerful way to kind of degauss or sort of, you know, lift all the filters before your encounter with so-and-so who is meeting death, where your anticipations, your fears, your aspirations, everything is sort of in the mix. And, you know, it's like just taking this big inhale and an exhale and really letting go and going into that connection, that experience of encounter with a dying person in a deeply open way. And I looked at these two kinds of work, in the prison system of dying people. Really, it had a very similar spirit, because Bernie also talked about the charnel ground, so what it was, whether it was homelessness, but for me it was working in the prison system and with dying people. This is the charnel ground.
And you could extend this, for me, I can get very kind of agitated and sure of myself about what's right and what's wrong in the world and politically. What the political situation in this country. And so if I meet someone who have a different opinion than I have, a different political view than I have, kind of my knee-jerk reaction is to argue and to stand for my position, right?
No.
And, oh yeah, a little bit. And yet, this not knowing this is the greatest tool we have in the world, is to stop and ask someone of a different political opinion, what's up with you? What's up with the way you're thinking? Tell me about how you see the wall. Tell me about how you see women's abortion rights. And to be able to, that's not knowing. For me, that's a really strong not knowing. It's like to pull away from all my agendas and really try to hear what's behind this view. And it's always, it's fear. It's and often misunderstanding of basic, all you have to do is turn on Fox News if you want to know what a lot of information gets very scrambled. Also, New York Times, very scrambled news. It's not like it's only Fox. And then we get so caught up with what we're told, what that is. Oh, that's the truth. That's my truth. And the power of this not knowing that Joan mentions, that Bernie set up as the foundation of Zen peacemakers, continually, to this day, is the most important thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of you were here last night, and of course we're being blinded by the lights, so we won't even ask you to raise your hands. But I just want to mention the other two tenets in case you weren't here last night, which the first is not knowing. And by the way, in a conversation with Cinda Rushton, who's the top ethicist at Johns Hopkins, she's learned so much from these three tenets, and she equates not knowing with what she calls, or what's called in her world of Johns Hopkins, clinical humility, which I think is a wonderful way to reflect on it. Right. And then the second tenet of bearing witness. What is it not to separate from whatever's arising in the present moment, to really be fully connected to it? Maybe you can reflect for a moment. You spoke about that last night. Egyoku did a beautiful reflection on not knowing. And
yes. I don't remember a thing I said last night.
Neither do I. I was listening carefully.
And yet, to bear witness is, I remember I was talking about this great example for me, because we always think of bear witness as bearing witness to one person. But this is a story I heard recently about a woman who was in charge of park ranger at Yosemite National Forest. And they were getting ready to have a meeting to decide what to do in this project. And she took a walk in the Mariposa Grove among the sequoia trees. And, sequoias are huge. You can't really see them as all as one thing, because you just see the trunk or at great distance what's going on with them. But she was walking, and suddenly she could hear the sequoias in her mind's heart. And they were saying, "We are dying. We are thirsty. Can you help us? We are dying. We are dying." And this one woman, Sue Beatty is her name, park ranger, head of some administrative thing in the park, single-handedly changed the way that they were organizing the hydrology system there for the sequoias. And what they did was they pulled up all the parking lots, all the refreshment stands, all the toilets and everything, and took them all away so that the ground was open again, and so that the trees could receive the water that was running off everywhere. And they recovered. And now this is like all of worldwide an example of saving this incredible national forest. She bore witness to the suffering of the trees. Can you imagine being so open as to be able to bear witness to, we are suffering? I mean, I live in New York City. My Zindo is downtown. I can walk 2 blocks and I'll be at the Bowery Mission. And I promise myself to bear witness every day to the homeless people on the subway. Then right after my zazen in the morning, I walk past a drug treatment center. I don't know what it's doing in Soho, but there it is. And there are all these people outside, and they've just gotten whatever it is that they take to help them get through the day. Bear witness. Don't push them away. But to bear, yes. This too, these people have been so burdened by their lives that they have fallen into drug addiction. So burdened. That's bearing witness. Then the next one is action.
Well, and
Go ahead.
In terms of bearing witness, just to make a little Buddhist aside, Avalokiteshvara means to perceive the sound of the world.
Yes.
And it's this capacity to listen really deeply.
Right.
And in such a way that, the notion of a small subjectivity, that is, this is about my little self, but actually, we expand our subjectivity to include all beings and things.
Right.
And then I'm thinking about a piece from Shantideva where Shantideva's saying, if you step on a thorn, your hand immediately goes to your foot, and be good, Dr. Yuhu, Boohoo, be good. Before you blow the bubbles on us. Okay, this is life. It's just, like bubbles. So, if you step on a thorn, your hand immediately goes to the foot and just pulls out the thorn. There's no kind of cogitation, request. It's just immediate like that. So, Musa Soseki was a 14th century great Japanese designer of gardens and also a great thinker. He wrote a beautiful treatise called Dialogues in a Dream. And in it, there's a short piece on compassion. I heard there was, Sharon and Bob. It was sort of, compassion or altruism or compassion's too, I don't know. Listen, I think compassion is, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said compassion is necessity. Without it, it's not a luxury. Without it, everything's going to perish. But in any case, Soseki divides compassion into sort of 3 categories. One is common compassion. That's biased, referential compassion with an object. That's the compassion that all of us are familiar with. Then there's compassion that is conceptual, that is based in a moral imperative, that is based in a view of the Dharma. And then there's non-referential compassion. That is this kind of seamless response to the suffering in the world.
Right.
And Soseki suggests that, and that what our practice is about developing this quality of non-separation so that the action is not like, I'm going to be a good person kind of thing.
Right.
But it is that unconditional, unself-conscious response to the suffering of the world as it is.
Right. Which is the fundamental Buddhist perspective.
Yeah.
Right. We're all in this boat together, and we're crossing the sea of suffering.
Okay, so, Roshi.
The third of the three tenets
is
compassionate action or responsive action or loving action. We've worked with different kinds of language, healing action. But it comes naturally from the bearing witness, you know.
And not knowing.
And the not knowing.
Yeah. Because
if you're not fixed in some fixed position and you see what needs to be done, you do it.
You pull the thorn out of the foot of the world.
You do. And you don't like say, oh, blah, blah, blah. You know, you actually do it. And it's my contention that bodhisattvas have more fun. We get in the boat together. Hey, we're all in this boat together. And, you know, we're helping people. How cool is that?
And Roshi, I have to tell you, because I've been looking at the social psychology, neuroscience, and et cetera of compassion, it's really interesting. It reduces inflammation, it enhances immune response, it enhances longevity. So, and you know, by the way, it lights up the pleasure networks in our brain. It's better than eating Brussels sprouts like I had as a kid, but if you have them at, 10,000 waves, they're really good. But anyway, and that it's viral, and that it's morally uplifting when we observe it.
Yeah.
And then everybody benefits.
Yeah. So the action step is terribly important. It's not enough to bear witness. Some movement must occur. Otherwise, there's a tendency to become hollow, to drop back. So it's really necessary to take a step. And even if, it's a mistake, then you learn. Then you go back to the not knowing, oops, now let me find another way to be of service. I mean, that's the most fun in life, is to serve, is to care for others and to make a difference. I mean, it's a joy. It's just what she's describing in neurological terms.
Sorry, thank you. I've been ruined. But anyway, we are coming to the end of this dialogue. And I'm just to let you know, Roshi Enkiu and I have walked the mountains of eastern Tibet. We've circumambulated Kailash. We've walked many places in the Himalayas, and she's abandoned me now. No, it's all right. But anyway,
my cardiologist abandoned you. So,
but it's been, and every year we have the joy of co-leading with Kaz Tanahashi, who is another radical, socially engaged person around ending war and ending nuclear proliferation.
So that's at Upaya Center. This is a little an ad for our retreat that we do every year. It's so much fun, and it's in silence. The whole, this large group. It's already full, I think.
It's full this year and next year.
Come 3 years from now, you can join us.
In the grave.
It's a great retreat. It's in silence, very serious, but we do have some good talks and some good fun. Now, I did bring a short little poem.
Oh, good.
That was written by Adrienne Rich.
Oh, good.
In the 60s. 68 was a bad year in this country. Hard year. And she wrote this. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my life with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. That is us. That's each of us now today. I have to cast my life with those who, age to age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. That's worth looking at. Huh?
Roshi.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
To you.